Lerato, it's wonderful to have you here, thank you. And I'd also like to introduce Hansi Momodu Gordon from Tate, Assistant Curator at Tate Modern, who will be in conversation with Lerato. And I'd first of all like to talk a little bit about Hansi, because I think we're going to hear a lot more about Lerato in due course. Hansi's had a very interesting time, and I think she has one of the best jobs around at the moment. She's came to Tate in 2011 and worked on the Damien Hirst show, and then later worked on the Ellen Gallagher show, which was a fantastic show, I thought. She's also been involved in some of the major projects in the Turbine Hall, particularly Richard Tuttle most recently, I think. But she's also worked on some of the live projects in the tanks that is now a year or so ago, and a very exciting program, and I think we'll all see the tanks again in a very different form when the new building opens. She's also worked on projects both based in London and across parts of Africa, and in particular something called Across the Board, which I think was a very interesting project, which was in Accra, Douala, and Lagos. And her role at Tate is takes in research and development of art from Africa and its diaspora for Tate. And she works with Tate Collection, she works with the Africa Acquisitions Committee, so her focus and her knowledge is very appropriate for this evening. So, Hansi, thank you very much indeed. I first saw the work of Lerato Shadi in 2012 at Dakar in Senegal, the biennial in Dakar. And in fact, I didn't see Lerato because she was covered up, but there was this object in the space. That's how I first saw you. And I think we'll probably hear about that work a little bit later. But having seen the work and being very impressed with it, it happened at the same time as a very fortuitous partnership that Iniva has with the Royal Overseas League. And the Royal Overseas League works with Hospital Field Arts in Scotland, and together they have annual scholarships for visual artists, where artists come over for a month, often their first visit to the UK. So talking with them, out of that came the invitation to Lerato to come for a month in 2013, a month in Arbroath, Scotland, a place that is extraordinary, cold, chilly, but an extraordinary place, which Hospital Field is a Victorian house with an art collection and an estate. And the studios are part of the buildings, part of the, I think they were part of the stables. But it's an extraordinarily welcoming environment, and artists spend time there making new work. And part of the partnership with Russell Arts and Hospital Field Arts was also that Lerato would have an opportunity to present new work, and that's why we're here today. Lerato's been working on the new work on the other side of the wall, writing one day, erasing the next, and she'll be working on it until the end of Tuesday next week. So if you come by again, you'll see her working at certain times during the day. I think for us at Iniva, we have this extraordinary window, which is quite unusual for a gallery, but it does mean with that window, we have the opportunity of asking artists to speak to the street, and that's really what this opportunity is about. It was very much over to Lerato as to what she wanted to do. I'm not going to talk much about the work because I think that'll come up in a minute, but I hope that gives you the context of why Lerato's here today. It's her first presentation in the UK. We're enormously pleased that we've been able to bring her to the UK, and we've had a lot of interaction with the work on the street. But I will now hand over to Hansi. Lerato, thank you for your conversation.
Thank you. Is my microphone on? I have to say it's been an absolute pleasure, so thank you very much for the invitation. Lerato and I spent a couple of hours together over the last week just discussing works and what we might share with you in the conversation this evening. There's so many exciting strands, complicated moments and quite moving aspects of the work that I want to draw out in the conversation. Not only your references to history, but I think what we see with some of the images here that you'll see rolling on the slideshow are images of works of around about 4 to 5 years of practice. And what you notice when looking back over this trajectory of work is actually there's a series of motifs and materials that you've kind of compiled. You seem to be constructing a language for yourself in these works. And I wanted to just ask you how important these kind of motifs and materials are to your practice, and whether there was a particular work that you feel was a starting point for that, or a break from earlier kinds of work. So I guess it's a question about material.
I mean, you're completely right that I kind of see every work that I make is sort of a full work on its own. It can be viewed within its own, but I'm always aware of how it connects with previous works. And I'm always, I kind of think of it as having a conversation with myself. For example, the way I look at performance and the history of performance art, I usually think of it as a conversation with myself. Whether it's Silogilwe, which is the knitting piece for 7 hours, and wondering about how the importance of the camera, and then that also carries through with Sibone, the writing piece that I did earlier, and then looking at, let's say for example, Sibone, where the performer is present but absent, so those kind of narratives go through most of the works. And then
you definitely get the sense of evolution from one work to another. And I know we discussed that 50 grams was in a way a sketch piece for a later work.
Yeah, actually, I think the idea for 50 gram or 50 gram came about with Tlogo, but I shot 50 gram after Tlogo had been performed for the first time, and it's interesting how an earlier work sort of brings up maybe questions or something that add to the next work, or in working in a piece you sort of have strands that you can't follow, and you sort of leave those and follow this strand and come back. There's so many interconnecting pieces, and most of the time after I've made a work and I look at it, of course after giving it a few months or two, I kind of look at it and think,
that's what it's about.
Yeah. Now I see where that connection comes in with this one, or how.
But what I think, there's absolutely these threads that kind of develop and change, but what I also see is a real kind of signature where you bring in this palette which is quite reduced, so often it's white or red, and the framing is also very specific in your work, which I think is very interesting, whether it's a kind of single shot to camera, or if you're sort of framing yourself within the white cube or on the plinth. I think it's a very deliberate choice of framing the body and kind of symbolically the black female body. And I wondered how important that is to you in your work.
It's very important. I think what I keep thinking about is that when the audience looks at my work, they don't have to know that I'm a South African with this particular history. But as a performance artist, as an artist, as a practitioner, I'm always aware of the kind of history that comes with this body. And I think that I have to be responsible to that. I can't, I definitely can't put this body on the floor. And if I do put it on the floor, then I have to have a very, very good reason as to why it's on that floor. And I'm very aware of the white cube. I'm aware of the history that revolves around it. I'm also quite aware of how exclusive it is, and that it's got a history. Even also now, you still have conversations about how some spaces, some gallery spaces, some institutional spaces are not allowing that they basically have show mainly white males and act as if everyone else doesn't exist in the world, is not making art.
So it's both the physical and invisible kind of structures, really, of power of display. And I think it's interesting that you do engage with this history of display of the black female body. When you are raising the body up onto a plinth, you are kind of engaging in that history, really.
Yeah.
I don't know if you could talk a bit more about that.
What I keep thinking about is, how do you talk about the black female body without reconsuming its objectification? How do you, let's say, talk about Sarah Badman without imaging her breast and her buttocks? How do you move from that and start talking about the subject? So it's kind of those ideas of that, yes, I want to talk about the problematics around being a black female and the problematics that come with that, but I'm not interested in reconsuming
or perpetuating that image.
Exactly.
Yeah, because what you really get with this work is something which is very visually and formally very subtle. It's you know, it's almost you know, a light touch, but the subject, you know, is very strong and very political.
Yeah, because also what you're talking about is also like, most of the works have a subtle violence to it. They look very well put together, they look beautiful, they have a visually arresting quality to it, but they're also very violent. But the violence comes at you very subtly. And I usually think of it that it's sort of how I experience the world in this body. There's usually a sort of constant violence, constant racism, and every time I feel as if I'm comfortable, a comment comes up or something happens that just draws me out of that comfort space.
One of the things I think that's happened more and more recently is that racism has got kind of gone underground, and in a way we safe it in this country when it was more overt. So now it is that kind of subtle violence, I think. But talking again of that, one of the images of other artists' work that came to mind when I was thinking about your practice was an artist like Tracy Rose, who also has this very violent act of kind of carving words into the wall. And also this idea of knitting and weaving, I think, is an early piece of hers from the 90s. And then you've got this, as I mentioned before, this very kind of simple palette of red, which is very powerful and an evocative colour. Maybe you could talk about that. I wanted to ask you, because that for me really connected with Julia Tiku, who's also a very kind of political artist in working in Nigeria at the moment. And I just wondered if there were any artists that, that you feel have kind of influenced your practice, or kind of conceptually or formally had an impact on the work that you're making.
Initially, I mean, Tracy Rose and Bernie Seal are, you know, the big black female artists that have been working in South Africa. But when it comes to, it's also one of the topics that black people have been making work, have been writing. There's creating a great big body of knowledge, but that body of knowledge is not easily accessible. And when it comes to people who have inspired me, they've sort of come trickling down, if that makes sense, in the sense that I've had to really, really search and be like, this is the topic that I'm working with, who else is working with that, who else is out there, and really kind of going, how do I find all of this? And in South Africa, we don't necessarily have big libraries. The libraries we literally just have all the right names. That's, if I'm being quite blunt with it. So I do have a lot of female artists that I love it, like Carrie Mae Reeves and Simpson and so on. But when it comes to, I think, a constant form of inspiration and things that I look back at, I'd say it's the women around me and in my this story of my own country and the idea that official apartheid, I think, was in, let's not name the date, in case I do the wrong thing anyway. Official apartheid was some years back, but there was apartheid before that. Apartheid started in when the Yan family first arrived and started building our own hedge. And looking at my great-grandmother and how she was born within apartheid, survived official apartheid, and then is still alive now. So
there's something really interesting about living memory as well. I was thinking about that when I talked to my own grandmother and think about, she was born in 1923 or something. So what there is in that living memory of the women in your family.
Yeah, it's interesting. But it's also, I think, for me, not just about living memory, it's how they carry themselves and how you understand that there's a lot of obstacles and barriers that one has to navigate around, and looking at how they do it with such grace and such wisdom. And also most of the people that I'm thinking of probably wouldn't call themselves feminism.
Right.
Feminists.
This is one of the things I wanted to ask you, if you feel the term feminism or maybe womanism, which is the term that Alice Walker used, that felt more adequate to the kind of black context, if you feel that that's even adequate or relevant to the type of work that you're making, or if you feel that it's more than that.
When I think about it, like I was saying, you have these women who are living in I think, performing feminism or performing womanism, but they might not even be able to explain to you what feminism is, and I find it really...
It's not about the textbook definition,
yeah.
It's about the lived experience.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I wonder if we should talk specifically about some of the works, and I thought it would be interesting to show one of Lerato's video pieces. So maybe we could show Sugar and Salt, which is a work from 2013, and we can talk a bit more about a specific work. I wanted to show this piece because I have to say the first time I watched it, I found it very difficult to watch. But this time I really kind of enjoyed rewatching it. There's so much going on actually in that video. And it's a dialogue between the mother and daughter and the kind of licking of salt and sugar from one tongue to the other. And one of the things I wanted to touch on was how you often use your mother tongue to title your works. And this piece, obviously quite deliberately, well, I'm assuming deliberately is titled in English. So there's all these kind of layers going on about language. And the first time I watched this piece, after getting over the kind of physical, uncomfortable feeling about this interaction between the mother and daughter, I was actually really kind of taken in by the compassion between the two. And even though I couldn't understand what they were saying, I kind of really felt a personal connection, in this relationship between the mother and daughter. And I know that you've talked about in the past ideas around exclusion in terms of language and text. And I just wondered if you could maybe share a little bit more about this piece in relation to some of those things I've talked about.
You quite rightly mentioned that this is titled in English because it's important for the audience to know that even though those substances on the tongue look the same. One is salt and one is sugar. So that's a more informative title, one would say. And it deliberately doesn't have any subtitles to it. And I think that's also important because, as you mentioned, it's not really important for the viewer to know the specifics of what it is that has been said. That's been said between the two, but you get enough from what it is that is happening and what the body language is and all the sort of nuances that you kind of miss or don't miss the first time you look at it. And then as I spoke about it earlier, that I kind of look at my body of work as a conversation with myself. And one of the conversations is, again, the idea that thinking about where I grew up and the idea that there weren't any gallery spaces. And also you hear it way too many times, people saying, oh, but I don't understand art. I don't have access to it. So kind of having that in the back of my mind and thinking, how does somebody like me include very deliberately people who have been excluded within a certain context? And how do I also go about excluding people who are quite used to having easy access to certain works? So, yeah.
So was there anything in particular about the choice of salt or sugar as materials?
Well, I was thinking they both have the same color, and that one you really want to lick, the other you really don't want to. And my mother has sugar on her tongue, so my licking something off her tongue is quite pleasurable. That's why I'm not wincing, and that's going easy for me. And she's licking salt off my tongue. And yes, that uncomfortable feeling that you had at the beginning, and the idea of really having to go through this physical thing
almost
to
a barrier
sit. Is also one of the things that I was working with. I was thinking around that when I was thinking about what it is that the viewer would be seeing. And the tongue itself is so layered.
Well, maybe this became like a really literal reading, but then I started to think about the idea of mother tongue. I mean, you're literally licking the salt or the sugar off your mother's tongue, and this is a piece that, you're talking about in English. Perhaps that was just, becoming way too literal, but there's so many layers, I think, in that work. That was really interesting.
Yeah, I was interested in all those different kinds of layers, and also one of the things that I was being very conscious about and careful about is to make sure that the work doesn't come across as sexual in a way, in any way, because the tongue itself is a very erotic organ, and it could be. It's a
fine line.
It's very easy to kind of go the wrong way with that. But if you think of mother tongue, if you think of eroticism, if you think of, let's say, maybe colonialization as well, and the idea of how the tongue has been also kind of a battleground with the masks, and if you think of this language that we're speaking, of the colonial language, and all of those things were sort of the kind of things that were running through in my head. But also what I was very interested in is this very physical response to the piece that the audience might have when they were watching it. Yeah.
And the backdrop, the kind of textiles, again, the red comes through. And is that a conscious decision to be working with this kind of color palette, really?
Yeah, it was very conscious, and it was also very lucky for two reasons. One is that it has some birds on it, and also birds feed each other through the mouth, and it is a cloth that used to belong to my mother. I don't know when it started belonging to me. I think I just claimed it. Yeah.
Nobody knows the real provenance of it.
Yeah.
Maybe we could look at the other video piece, Matzogo, again from 2013. It's just a short piece of about 6 minutes, and talk about that work. It's another really beautiful work, and I think in this piece, what I find so poetic is that you basically end with the same components that you start with, but what you have this cake, it's made of the same material, but through this kind of physical act of destruction and then reassemblage, you kind of render these materials useless, or they don't have the same kind of use as they did originally, of their original intention. But maybe you could just talk more broadly about the piece and this beautiful music that we hear, and again this multi-layering of the newspaper and material.
Okay, maybe start with the music, because it's...
And do you think we could maybe have just a still of the video up so that we have it to refer to?
Yeah, to start with the music, maybe because it also connects with what we were talking about earlier, about this sense of exclusion and inclusion. The soundtrack is from two fairy tales that are very common for Tswana-speaking children. I think maybe a lot of South Africans as well know the stories. So these two particular fairy tales have songs within them, so the songs get jumbled up together so that the narratives get a bit confused. So if you're Tswana-speaking, you immediately have access, connection, history. You have a complete context to the music. While if you don't have access to those fairy tales, then it just sounds like sounds.
Yeah.
That's also one of the layers that I was working with inclusion and exclusion. And then the piece itself, I was thinking about the Berlin Conference of 1884. I think it happened in November. So when 14 different states, 14 different European states, including America, came together to divide Africa amongst themselves. And then I was also thinking about how the Black female body has been dissected in so many different ways. So in my head, I was thinking about the parallels between how one reads the land and one reads the female body. And also, again, another topic is how do you talk about the Black female body without objectifying it? And I was also looking at how, when you look at the continent, when you kind of look at colonialization, what's the word I'm looking for? It'll come back. You kind of sort of have, when you look at sort of those politics and you put the stock exchange underneath it, it always feels like, especially after because the Berlin Conference was very...
divisive?
Yes, thank you. Was a very divisive time. So also when you look at colonialization, you sort of use that as one of the marking points. Yeah.
One of the things I was just going to say, this piece of cake with its kind of triangular shape then does kind of draw out this map between Africa, America, and Europe. I don't know if you were thinking about this kind of triangulation of trade, but it also makes that reference, I think.
That's great. I wasn't thinking of that, but thank you. Now I am. Yes, I was definitely thinking of that triangular.
And we talked previously about this in terms of, you know, who has access to power as well and who gets to have a piece of the cake. We talked about. And so in a way it becomes the perfect symbol for this kind of, you know, this kind of conversation.
Exactly. And also for me, the missing bigger cake is also present in just that single piece of cake. So, yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic. I wonder if we should talk a little bit about Sipone and Makuba. So Makuba being the work that you created here, and then the earlier work that you'd created in Johannesburg and Berlin. Maybe we could have a still image of that, and you could just talk us through that piece, the process of making the earlier work.
That piece, I first performed it in Berlin, and the two pieces are similar, but they're also quite very different.
So if we maybe start, with the earlier one.
So this one was first performed in Berlin and then a month later in Johannesburg. And what I'm writing on the wall is my own biography. And here I only had, I didn't have an audience. The only audience was the camera. And it was important for me that I didn't have a live audience, because I was thinking, in writing my own biography, I wanted to see how naked with myself I could become. Sipone, directly translated, means mirror. So then the wall becomes this mirror that I look into. And I was also thinking about how when I tried to erase this story, trying to do the impossible of erasing a life or erasing scars. And even within the wall, that's not possible, because then it leaves traces. And thinking about all of that, it was important that I didn't have an audience. I think I just mentioned that. What else was I thinking? Also thinking about when is it a performance and when is it not a performance.
Well, you see that you play with that with a number of the work. So it always seems to be very deliberate as to whether you're performing to camera or if you're making a performance specifically for the camera, or if it's a performance with a live audience or a performance that's private and that gets revealed afterwards. So that seems to have been important for this work as well.
Yeah. Which is very different from this one, because this one, it's made with the idea that people can stand outside the window and have access to what has been written. It's large enough to be able to read from outside of the window. Yeah.
But I think that's interesting because with the two performances of this, and again, it's kind of dealing with the white cube space. So again, you're deliberately within art world spaces, I guess, like a art project space or an art gallery. And even though it's a kind of private act or private performance, you have chosen that particular space. And with this, I guess the relationship moves a little bit closer to the public domain because you're facing a window. You're facing the street, which is a kind of public sphere, but again, you're separated from it because of the window. So maybe you could talk a bit about the relationship between the public and private space and how that's kind of come through in these works.
With this work, this window is, because Iniva has done window shows before, so you sort of basically have the same construction with most of them, the difference being if the wall goes all the way up or there's a little bit of space on the sides, but basically you have this sort of stage, shop window effect. So again, becoming very conscious of how I would be presenting this particular body in that. And I was also just thinking about the dichotomies between being visible and invisible. I'm trying to think who wrote somebody wrote, in your white world, in your white world, the black body, my body, is always visible, which is very true, but it's also, at the same time, also very invisible. Because depending on, I hope I'm being eloquent, there's an example of, I'm forgetting her name, there's a black woman who was shot by the police, and her story is not in the news, and it's
a little bit about what makes. I mean, we talked about being being hyper visible, so it's always being on display, and some like the middle circle talks about the sexualization of the body. So as you become this sex object in a way, and how you want to have a profession that's beyond that.
Yeah.
But I guess there's also a sense of invisibility. It's a hypervisibility and an invisibility.
Exactly. So it's sort of, it's looking at those and playing with those, and the idea that here it's almost taking agency and putting myself on the stage and being very conscious and aware of what kind of body am I presenting to the public. So what is the public seeing? They're just seeing a working body.
But what's also interesting is that when you're not there, so people walking past the piece now, they can read your words and they have to imagine you. They will imagine you, the person who is writing. So again, It's really clearly playing with that idea of being present and being absent, and actually how the imagination of the black female body also takes over at a certain point. I wonder, maybe you could talk just kind of practically about how... if you set particular parameters when you make a piece like this. We talked a bit about the kind of the parameters of shape or form or the words that you choose, and the process of kind of thinking through a piece like this.
The two were very, very different. With this one, initially I was thinking of the different types of stereotypes. Stereotyping of the black female body and how to sort of deal with those, and also looking at, I think I mentioned it earlier, that black people or people of color have been producing a massive amount of knowledge, but that knowledge is not acknowledged. It's this sense of which knowledge is valid and which knowledge is not valid. And you read it a lot from, let's say, Grada Kilambo or from Bell Hooks, where they talk about how in an academic situation, when you have certain bodies producing knowledge, then the white institution sort of says that, well, because you're black, you write from a very emotional, irrational, or whatever point of view, and whiteness is always writing from a point of view that is rational and objective. So those ideas of that there is a body of knowledge out there that's been produced, and also thinking about Ferguson and all the protests that have been happening and how it's not new.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that protest has been happening all the time, thinking about how when you think of, let's say, slavery or colonialization, I came to the knowledge that there's been resistance very late, because what was available, that was not available. You had the narrative of colonization.
You have the main story.
You have the main story, yes, but the other story that there's constantly being
erased.
Resistance is being erased. So I'm sort of working with those ideas as well within this piece.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned Ferguson, because actually some of the wording in one of the pieces about my black body matters, I think that was some of the
that actually came from that
rhetoric,
because I think it's a hashtag or hashtag, thank you. Because I was thinking, is it a hashtag or a placard? Yeah.
Maybe we could open up to the audience in case anybody had any questions. I know that we've touched on quite a lot, but maybe there's questions from the audience to Lerato or...
Yes.
Hi, Lerato. Actually, I find myself coming to these talks and asking questions that are more like asking for advice. So it's not really technically a question. But I just want to hear more about what you were talking about. I'm a South African artist as well. And I feel when you talk about this idea of being seen and not seen and making conscious decisions about how you would like to place your body, I feel as an artist myself, that's like something I eat whatever I do, whatever exercise it is that I'm trying to, whether resist it or feed on it or whatever, there's some kind of structure that it always seems to read how it wants to read. You know, it's like this machine where even if you're entering it with violence and absolute resistance, it will overcome you, you know. And you talked about this white cube. This is something where I think as a Black South African artist, even those words, white cube, you know, you think of it and you think, okay, that's my space, that's where I work. But then you enter it and like you say, you're this black dot. And how do you, even though that's your exercise and you're very aware of it and you're trying to place yourself in a situation, how do you reconcile with the fact that sometimes, most of the times, you will still be read in that way that you don't necessarily want to be read in? Is it, like for me personally, it's like this secret thing in my head where I'm like, okay, fine, read me like that, but in my mind, I know what it's really about, you know, like the whole language thing, totally relate to that. But still, when I kind of presented that way, people are like, oh yes, you know, Zulu, wow, it's so great that you use your language. And I'm like, no, you know, so how do you deal with that idea that even if you present it like I'm resisting being read like that, it still will be read in a certain way. If it's like positive, it's accepted as in, we really love Black female artists, or we, you know, is that, you know, I'd just like to hear a bit more from you about how you deal with that.
I think so far when I make work, I don't think I'm resisting per se. And I think what I'm doing, most of the time I have two cousins who are about 18. And I keep thinking I make work for myself. I try to make work that I would like to see, and I keep thinking, if my cousins came to the gallery space, what is it that they will be seeing? What kind of image, what kind of work am I presenting for them? What is it that they will come out with? And I don't really think too much about what the white audience sees. I'm not saying I don't make work for the white audience and that they shouldn't see the work. Of course they should see the work. But when I'm thinking about the work, I'm mostly thinking about what is it that I would like to see, and perhaps what is it that I would like my cousins to see. And yeah, I try not to think too much about, oh, you're still going to read it in a negative way or whatever. I think what my job is to sort of be conscious about certain narratives and not to fall into certain traps. And that if I'm conscious about that and I work with those themes, then hopefully I can avoid certain pitfalls. And also, most importantly, I see the work as a journey. So if there's a mistake that I make, or if I falter somewhere, then I hope that I can learn from that and rectify it in the next work, or add, or whatever, continue the process and continue the conversation. And I hope so far I'm succeeding. I basically think of it as a process and as a conversation.
Hi, nice to see you again. I have a question, since you specifically mentioned the Berlin conference. As I understand it, you're located in Berlin right now, and Berlin specifically, but Germany in general, is a country that is not quite comfortable with the topic of racism, typically don't confront it, typically say that they don't have a colonial history, even though there was a Berlin conference. So I was wondering how living, working, studying in Berlin affects you personally and your work.
That's a very good question, because I think, also because I have an answer and I don't have an answer. Have an answer in the sense that I know that it is affecting the work, and that it's sort of, I think, brought me closer to certain topics and made me look at them more closely. I don't have an answer because I'm still there, and I feel like I'm still trying to deconstruct what it is that's happening there. The first year I lived in Prenzlauer Berg, which is mainly white. I saw another black person once a week. And you know you're in trouble when you literally greet every single black person you see. Then you know you're not seeing enough. So now we live in Wedding, where, thank goodness, I don't have to greet every person of color I see, because there is enough diversity there. So I'm sort of dealing with that, and my German is almost non-existent. I'm learning it. So I feel as if that's another layer where I'm like separate from that. But yes, learning about the Berlin conference, I was also surprised that Germans think they don't have a colonial history. I was like, okay. And I think one of those things is also one of the things that made me think about the idea of how knowledge is placed within hierarchies, and how, you know, this idea of whiteness, I'm thinking a lot about it because of being in Berlin, I think. Really just the idea that Germans could think of themselves in not having a colonial history, that they could think of themselves as being these really, really wonderful people because whiteness is pure and good. And you're like, but no, it's not. I experience it in a very violent way constantly. So all those topics is also the reason why I'm saying yes and no to the answer, because I'm still sort of learning and deconstructing, and yeah.
Hi. First of all, I want to thank you very much, because you brought to this building not a pinch of salt, not a pinch of sugar, but a pinch of awareness and humanity that has been very much appreciated, I think, from all of us. Your absence, and you too, will be felt, as well as your presence. So I think that has been a performance itself, our journey together. I work for Iniva, so obviously I'm talking from the building perspective, organization perspective. I've got two questions, and they relate to two pieces. One is salt and sugar, and I got really moved because I remembered the rituals that I had with my grandmother when she was alive. We had very simple rituals that are still in my heart, and I still remember about them. And so my question relates to the sense of, like how do you relate the rituals? We also had in our programs contemporary rites that was addressing this, like how in the contemporary society we relate to rituals, what are our rituals? And the other question, it is about Macuba, and I was looking at it from outside today, and I was looking at it as a mantra, because the idea of erasing and writing, it is repetitive in a way. And my question is whether or not this is a process of healing as well.
Let's start with Macuba. The answer is most definitely yes, it's a process of healing. And I think most of my works are a process of healing. Most of them are also very uncomfortable, and sometimes I don't want to do them. Today I did not want to erase what I had written, because I really liked what I had written, and I thought it was important.
Well, there's also something about labour as well in the work. Lots of them are very labour intensive.
Exactly.
And it's, the piece for 7 hours, I realise that's 7 hours that I spend going to work. Which you also
get it, yeah. But how I also think about it is that, of course it's relevant. I have to erase it because I'm talking about knowledge being erased, and that is painful. So I'm sort of going through the process, the historical process that I have been put through. I'm physically going through it, and it's been wonderful working here with you guys, but also going through that has been very uncomfortable. And yes, for example, Tloho is not a particularly great piece to physically experience, but like I mentioned earlier, that I make the works for myself, and then I make the works for, perhaps if I make for an audience, I'm literally thinking of Amogelang le Manana. And then when it comes to rituals, one, I'll tell you a secret. I was thinking about sugar and salt. Don't tell anyone. I was thinking about sugar and salt and thinking of where it came from. And I think where it came from is about 2 or 3 years ago. Before 2013. I was in a car with my mother. Somebody else was driving. Both of us were sitting in the back seat, and she had something in her eye, and she said, "Please get rid of this." And it was the most natural thing that she expected me to lick it off, because somehow the tongue is cleaner than a finger or whatever. And I licked it off, and she said, "It's still there, do it again." And then I think I did it 2 or 3 times, and it wasn't an unusual experience because she'd done it to me at some point. It's just that I think I just came back from traveling, or from having been away from her for a long time. So it sort of made me think of rituals and made me think of this very intimate act that I took for granted. And also thinking about, when you say rituals, when my grandfather died, I know for me and for 1 or 2 members of my family, we were thinking, oh my goodness, so much knowledge has died with him. He knew so much of our culture, so much of our rituals. But then after just, I think, thinking about it and letting a year or so pass, I realized that no, there's still a lot of rituals within how the family is structured and the things that I do, which don't need my grandfather to be there, and that we share together. So the idea of rituals and how I think about them, I think has sort of kind of keeps shifting and changing a little bit. Because also initially, I guess for me the word is so pregnant. When I think of rituals, I used to think of, I don't know, some big circle, some witch's circle with candles and big words and stuff, and you're like, that's a ritual. And now I realize if you have breakfast together every morning, that's a ritual. And yeah, learning to sort of appreciate the kind of rituals that make life more meaningful. I'm sorry for sounding like we are the world, but yes, trying to appreciate the rituals that make life more meaningful.
I wanted to ask how much of your work are you consciously using memory with? Because when this particular work that happens in the window, the word that jumps into my mind is palimpsest, which is what the Romans used to use before paper. So it's a piece of material of which you write on and then you wash away, but you still have the residue of what was written on it before. So it's almost as though there's tiny moments of truth every time you wash the material away, truth for that specific moment of what was written, and you keep revisiting it. So as you erase everything that you've actually written, how much of consciously are you working with the truth of the memory or a memory of a memory?
I think I'm constantly working with that. When I make work, it's important for me that it's not necessary for the audience to have access to my biography or my history. They don't need to have access to that. But I constantly tap into that to make the work. And with this particular piece, I am working with the idea that almost like the futility of trying to erase something that was there, that you can't really erase lives, or how much can you erase a history? Because I find it very violent and painful that I don't have access to a lot of my own history, and that to a certain extent you still have the idea or the narrative that before colonialization there was just darkness in Africa, and you still have people saying that in South Africa you still have people saying that black people should be thanking white people for colonialization. So this idea of that which has been erased, or that which is no longer there, and trying to build on it. It's part of those conversations I'm having with myself. The idea that how, with Sibone, writing my own history, I was thinking about how, I think I read somewhere once, what did they say? Something to the effect that he who controls history controls the present and hence controls the narrative of the future, or how the future is composed. So it's something that's very prevalent in my head about how, without having access to this very important part of my own,
or even having the power to be able to write your own history.
Exactly. Yeah. How do you construct your own sense of self, and then being confronted with all this other negative stereotypes and being confronted with all kinds of other knowledge. So there's
There's also a sense of starting from scratch again and again and again, rather than sort of building and progression. It's also a sense of starting from scratch.
Yeah, but also understanding that it's not really starting from scratch because that
something was there.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Faustin Liniakula. He's a dancer, primarily a choreographer, but he has this work which is a really beautiful piece called Le Cargo, and it's about the history of the Congo. But he's talking like how can he, with such a heavy history, how can he narrate his own personal history and that of his countries? And it's about what's the kind of memory of the body, and that really resonated, I think, with Soproni in terms of narrating the history of your body, really.
Yeah.
It was interesting. I don't know if there's any more questions.
Hi. I was just curious about the sort of distinction between writing and ideas and the form of your practice in where you bring in the medium of how a piece of work is going to be expressed, as opposed to the sort of dialogue we're having here this evening. I mean, obviously, you have to have an input or a catalyst of some sort to want to make a piece of work, but I'm just curious about at what juncture, at what stage do you actually deal with that? I mean, when does a piece of work go on a wall, or when is it three-dimensional?
So when does a piece of work move from being an idea to a piece of work?
Yes, that has to be part of it, but I'm just curious because of the range of your practice that the ideas come back to the same source, but how you come about choosing the medium you want to make a particular piece in.
That's a really difficult question. I don't know.
Sorry.
I'm really not sure. I think the work and what it is that I want to say or deal with dictates the medium that I'm going to work with. For example, let's say with Musakwa Nako, which is, I think there's images of it here, me sitting, knitting a long carpet. Somehow it was obvious for me to deal with that because two things were important. One is that I wanted to literally physically be in this space and take over the space. The performance was done over 10 days and it ended on the day of the opening. So I was performing while because it was a group show, I was performing while, that's what I'm talking about. I was performing while the other works were being set up. And it's the NBK Nieuwe Berliner Kunst. And also being in Berlin, I wanted to really physically be in this space and think about taking over the space. But also here, with 50 gram that you spoke about earlier, which is the one with just where you see the knitting, I was thinking about encoding meaning into this piece of fabric. So one of my inspirations was Arabic text, in that I really love the way it looks, but I really love the way it looks, and it's always fascinating to me that it all looks the same, that I can't read it. I know that it's encoded with meaning. I know that whenever it is that I'm looking at it, it is saying something meaningful, but I do not have the tools to give me access to that meaning. And when I'm looking at it, it just really just looks like a beautiful pattern that looks the same. So I was working with that with this, and the idea that perhaps the viewer might not have access to the tools to decode the meaning that I have encoded in it, but to work with the idea that meaning has to be encoded in it. And that while I was sitting there for those days, I was really looking at how all those hours of me sitting there, it's literally me knitting myself within this piece and thinking about how do I go about doing that, which knitting patterns and techniques do I use, what tools do I use to encode that meaning, do I use what I'm thinking, do I use what I'm feeling? So, yeah, I think the work dictates what it is, and what I want to say dictates which medium. I hope that answers
Yeah,
the
thank you.
question.
If there aren't any others, so one more, yeah.
Hi, Lerato. I wanted to ask you perhaps a more distinct question about choosing whether the audience is live or slightly removed, recorded, and if you ever feel like you've made a work that you wished was the opposite, i.e. either you made a work on your own just with the camera and you wish later maybe it had been live, or maybe more the reverse.
There is actually one. Midlo, which is the tape one. I performed it live, and once. I'd been thinking about recording it, but I performed it live, and I knew that I wanted the piece to be in the nude, but when I performed it live, I had skin-colored tone, I had underwear on, and that's also when I realized that is not a live piece. And it goes back to what you were saying, because then you had this, the physicality and the presence of the performer, I think, was just too immediate. And I felt like the audience wasn't able to see the work. They were just confronted with this physicality and with this nude body that is getting wrapped and that's half nude inside or not. And and I still wanted to make the work, so that's also when I decided, okay, it really has to be. I can't perform it again live or anything, but I thought what I wanted to say with that was important for me, and I wanted the work to work, so I performed it for camera. So that's the one work that I can think of where I thought, audience, no, that didn't work.
Thank you everyone for your questions, and Lerato, thank you so much. You've been brilliant. It's been really nice to speak with you.
And thank you.